Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's webinar by Kingsbridge. Today's webinar is going to be focused around some of the recent compliance activity which HMRC are undertaking in the application of the off-payroll working rules. A few bits of housekeeping that we normally cover off at the start of the session, just whilst a few more people join. We're expecting the session to last 1 hour in length, so 60 minutes up until 2 o'clock. We're going to have a sort of 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. So if you have got any questions that you want to ask throughout the session, you should have the Q&A and comments box at the very bottom of the page. If you submit them there, the team at Kingsbridge will get hold of them, and we'll get as many of them answered as possible in this session. The session is also being recorded as well, so we plan on sending out a recording of the session tomorrow, and you should get that via email. So if there's anything that you miss or you have to drop off, or if you're joining late, you can just take a copy and obviously go from there and watch it again if you need to. So my name is Ryan Dawson. I work in the I-35 team here at Kingsbridge. There are a number of us in the team, including my co-host today, which is Andy Vesey. Andy Vesey is head of tax at Kingsbridge, but I'll let the man himself give you an introduction into who he is and what he does here at Kingsbridge.
Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, so I've been head of tax at Kingsbridge, particularly really to do with the IR35 and employment status side of things. I've been with Kingsbridge since 2019. I started life in the old Inland Revenue when it was a good department in the 80s. Left there, joined various accountancy practices, large and small, and then started specialising in employment status. Around about the introduction of the IR35 legislation. I was with QDOS at the time, and I was with QDOS for 17 years and left there to join Kingsbridge, and I was head of tax when I left QDOS. And during that time, probably defended around about 500 plus contractors during IR35 inquiries, and vast majority of those thankfully were successful. So hopefully I know what I'm talking about.
Perfect. So yeah, the purpose of this session, as we've covered there, is all around the compliance activity which HMRC are currently undertaking. So Andy, as an introduction, and I should mention, it wouldn't be a live webinar without some technical difficulties. So if Andy does drop off the camera briefly, almost as if we've just timed it, doing it there. There we go.
Indeed.
Andy, would you like to give a kind of brief introduction then as to what type of compliance activity is currently happening in respect of the off-payroll working rules? Okay,
I think as we originally predicted with the off-payroll working rules, HMRC's activity was always likely to be probably about 18 months, 2 years down the line, once the rules had bedded in, and now we're actually seeing that coming to fruition. So yes, the rules have been bedded in. We've had, we nearly have had 2 years of the rules when it comes to the 5th of April of this year. So at the tail end of last year, we were starting to see inquiry notices or letters of notification of compliance activity being sent to a number of our clients, either directly or indirectly. So, activity has now begun, as we probably forecasted. And so let's say we've seen a number of our clients that, and this might only be a trickle at the moment, but it's probably likely to cascade.
And I think what we'll do, so we're going to show you what some of those letters look like. We're going to cover off what they are, what they could lead to, etc. But I think a good starting point is really just to highlight the sort of difference between what used to happen with contractors in respects of compliance letters versus what's happening now. So what I'm going to do is just share my screen, and we'll run through what that looks like. So assuming, unless somebody tells me otherwise from Kingsbridge, you can see this screen here. I'm hoping. Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Perfect. So Andy, do you just want to run through what this is? So this is typically what a contractor would receive in respect of I-35 compliance prior to April of 2021 and post that if HMRC are looking at them.
Yeah, absolutely. So where HMRC wanted to launch an inquiry into an individual PSC, it would start with this notice. So it clearly sets out the fact that HMRC are opening an IR35 inquiry. It confirms it's not a CT inquiry, and it asks for some pretty standard information. So first of all, a breakdown of the income of the company. With this notice, it was only one tax year. That was the 5th to the 5th of April 2019. Then, I mean, it could be multiple years, of course, but this just happened to be 1 year. Then it asks for all copies of the contracts and the supporting documentation around that income, and that includes things like timesheets, the contracts themselves, extension paperwork, any letters, emails, etc. Everything really that's documented that relates to that contract that falls in that period of inquiry. So that's the starting point for HMRC, and it also asks on the second page, I think near the top there, will you please also tell me whether you've considered the possibility of the company being subject to IR35, and if you have, explain to me why you've arrived at that conclusion. So this is to ensure that the contractor's just not decided, well, I'm outside IR35 without properly considering the IR35 legislation. That's relevant basically in case, should HMRC be successful in concluding that IR35 applies, it's relevant to the penalty situation. So if the contractor hadn't properly considered IR35 and HMRC apply the legislation, then they could apply a penalty as well. Now, I have to say, I haven't seen or HMRC been able historically to successfully apply a penalty because of the very subjective nature of IR35, but plus as well, most of the contract, or all the contractors I've defended, were pretty good with their compliance. They'd probably had their contracts reviewed by somebody like Kingsbridge, and so they'd already got that sort of supporting evidence.
To be clear, Andy, because there's one thing that I want to ask you on this. It's the tone of this letter. So this is typically what you'd see a contractor receive, and the tone is quite direct. It's quite formal, isn't it? It's asking very, very specific information about what's happened in that contractor's engagement.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a starting point. So what I would say is once that information's been submitted, normally what would happen is that HMRC would then progress the inquiry, and they'd probably want they would normally ask for a meeting with the contractor, and ordinarily, if it was me defending the contractor, more often than not would say no thank you, we don't want a meeting, put your questions in writing, and HMRC would then produce a working practices questionnaire, probably of about 50 questions. It's important to remember that whilst HMRC might like a meeting with the contractor, it's the contractor's right to deny that. HMRC cannot demand to have a meeting. That is not their right to do so. Yeah. So leading on from there, we'd get the questionnaire, and you'd answer that, And then normally the next stage would be that HMRC want to talk to the end client to verify what the contract has said about the working practices. And it's quite a lengthy process. And those individual inquiries, they can last a good number of years, depending on what evidence there is. It's from the point of receiving that first letter, there's very few incidences I've seen where HMRC have said, "Oh yeah, that's fine, we agree, IR35 does not apply." It would have to be pretty overwhelming evidence. So, for instance, the contractor had actually used a substitute for in the year of inquiry, and you've proved it, you've documented it, you've proved it, and HMRC would probably say, "Yeah, okay, we agree." But the ordinary course of events is that inquiry just progresses, and so it's a time-consuming process.
So before we then touch on these letters which end clients in the private sector have been receiving in respect of the new rules, we've already sort of predicted on previous sessions that we've had around that compliance activity and when that might take place. But there's been a few instances of mentions in conversations that even I've had with clients of Kingsbridge, where they've mentioned around the increasing of HMRC's activity, the increased budget that they have, etc. How much of that do you think goes towards these letters, and does it really have any influence on kind of how many are likely to go out in the future?
Well, I know, obviously, I mean, in the autumn statement last year, there was, the Chancellor had committed £79 million over the next 5 years to enable HMRC staff to tackle that more serious cases of fraud and address tax compliant risk among wealthy taxpayers, and that was forecasted to bring in an additional 725 million over the next 5 years. Now, that's not specifically for employment status, but he did actually go on to say that the government was committed to ensuring that HMRC has sufficient funding to enable it to maintain its compliance performance over time. So I think what we have to recognise is that the off-payroll rules were introduced, for for two reasons, probably more than two reasons, but one, obviously, to get more revenue, but also that HMRC just could not police IR35 in its old form. It was as a revenue raiser, it was hopeless, and HMRC clearly, weren't able to police it or win enough cases to bring in more tax revenue. Off payroll rules, very different story. So what we've now got is, rather than dealing with individual contractor companies, you've got larger organisations with a lot of contractors sat in one place, and it's a lot easier for HMRC to police that legislation, and if there's non-compliance, for want of a better word, to tackle that much more quickly than with individual contractors.
So I think then let's jump in and show you what those letters look like. Now we've kind of highlighted in this session, or Andy's mentioned it, we've got a number of clients. There's a handful of clients, both insured and non-insured, that we're currently working with, and obviously going back to HMRC with a response to these letters. And I would just encourage as well, if anyone's got any questions at all on anything that we mention, or what these letters are, what they could lead to, etc., we'll try and cover as much off as we can. But if there's anything specific that you want to know, then please do pop it in the Q&A box. We'll try and answer as many of those as possible. But what we'll do then, Andy, I will share my screen again for you. So this letter, this is the letter that end clients have been receiving. So the first thing that I'd mention with this is, some of you may have got these letters. Maybe you're an agency and you don't know if your end client has received one of these letters. You know, Andy, what advice do you give initially in terms of discovering whether or not your supply chain has one of these letters, apart from the obvious thing, which is talk to each other?
Well, yeah, that's key, isn't it? Communication. It really is, right probably from the outset, before, you know, it's really sort of preempting this situation. So you would want to be able to sort of asking if you're an employment business, you would be wanting the end client to notify you, probably ASAP, that they've actually received one of these letters, just really to put the employment business on notice. It's obviously important to realise at this stage the employment business isn't particularly that they're not under inquiry, but of course they're the fee payer. So it has that that effect that if anything goes wrong here, or if HMRC find anything wrong, then it's going to have a knock-on effect with the fee payer. Yeah, particularly. Yeah. So if HMRC have decided that a certain number of workers should be recategorised as inside IR35, then that's going to have the knock-on effect. The fee payer is going to have to stump up the tax and national insurance. So
that also has an impact on things like insurance, for example, because whether it's with us or with somebody else, most insurance comes with some sort of claim notification period, which that would ordinarily be the date that the letter was received by the client. So I guess that sort of overall transparency goes towards that point as well. But do you want, Andy, just go through what's being asked by HMRC here? What's the attitude of the letter? What's the tone of it like?
I think it's soft isn't the word, but it's not particularly aggressive. It's the tone is, well, we're going to, I want to sort of work with you if you like. I want to just check that, make sure that everything's okay. And, I want to understand your processes, and just to make sure that everything, you're doing things right, and just to satisfy HMRC. So it's, this is only the initial letter, remember, and it's probably easier if we just sort of go through that letter. So the first thing to realise is that, I think the second paragraph, I'm opening a compliance check. So there we go. We know that this is a check into the operation of the off-payroll rules, and then it says in the next paragraph, the approach I'll be taking is set out in our briefing, supporting organisations to comply with the off-payroll rules. That briefing was back in Feb 2021, I think. And again, that briefing talks about, working with you, a collaborative approach, etc. And then we go to the about my check. I'd like to talk about your systems and your processes. And then initially, I'd like to understand your organisation's hiring processes, processes of deciding status, and if you've actually engaged a contracted out service provider. So we're put on notice as to what they're looking at within the off-payroll rules regime. And then on the next page, what you need to do now is, well, they'd like to have a chat. Initially. So that would probably be more of an informal chat, because it's attached to the letter, and we'll show that in a minute or so, I'm assuming. But there's a schedule of information that HMRC have requested, and HMRC do say you don't need that to have that completed when we have our initial chat. So that's why I say it's more of an informal chat when you first start. And then HMRC will explain what will happen next. So if after the chat and receiving the response to the schedule of information, HMRC decide, that everything's okay with the company's systems and procedures, they'll probably close it down, the compliance check down, because your risk, or the company's risk, will be deemed to be low. But I would say that, like I said, alluded to earlier, this is only the start, because when you look at the schedule of information, you probably come to the conclusion that, while that sort of scratches the surface, there's probably a bit more information that HMRC would probably like to see.
And I mean, there's one question that I can see. I know we saved, or we're saving questions till the end, but there's one that's more or less relevant to this page here, and it's all in respects really of how trusting can you be that HMRC will actually help organisations put things right. And one thing to note in here is probably about halfway down this page, it does still highlight and make you aware that if something is wrong, it may mean that you have not paid the right amount of tax, national insurance contributions, or apprenticeship levy. You may need to pay us, or we may owe you money. If you pay us any tax or NICs late, you need to pay interest. We also pay interest on amounts that we pay back to you. So regardless of how soft this letter may seem, or how informal and kind of welcoming the approach is almost, you must remember that at the end of it, HMRC are still looking to collect tax, aren't they?
Oh yes, absolutely. That's what you've just highlighted is pretty standard anyway. But it's kind of like the tactic, I suppose, they use in nudge letters, which is quite psychological, and it might create an element of doubt. You're right. Ultimately, if something's wrong, HMRC will no doubt find it, and there will be tax, national insurance, and interest to pay. That's pretty standard fare, I would, but nevertheless enough to probably create some doubts.
And HMRC seems to also make reference to the fact that they did implement the soft landing period, and they've made references here as well, haven't they?
Yes, they have. But again, just to affirm, really, just to assure the taxpayer that we won't be charging penalties, but unless there's evidence of deliberate non-compliance. But I mean, deliberate non-compliance, it's a bit short of fraud, isn't it? At the end of the day. You've got that reassurance, but of course that's only for the year ended 5th of April 2022. Of course, it doesn't apply post 5th of April. So this current tax year. If there's errors, and particularly, I suppose, if they were careless, then you could be in a penalty situation for 22-23 and years beyond.
And just before we move on and show the schedule, because that I think will probably allude to a lot more detail as to what HMRC are actually asking of the end client. There isn't necessarily a trigger to who would receive this letter, is there? It's not a case of you've done something wrong, that's why you're getting it. And certainly what we're seeing is there are different industries that are getting this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've got to remember, most or all HMRC inquiries, compliance checks, they're all risk assessed, and so, we don't know what the risk assessment criteria is, and nor should we know that. But you've got HMRC have a wealth of information at their fingertips. So these current off-payroll rule inquiries, they originate out of RTI reports, employment intermediaries reporting. That would probably fit with the timing of these compliance check letters. But also HMRC have their own sophisticated computer software called Connect, and that's been around since 2010. And that is, let's say, sophisticated computer software and a key data analyzing tool. Now, HMRC aren't keen to talk about it, but it identifies hidden relationships between people and organizations and data that couldn't be previously identified. And it's got the capacity to highlight patterns in HMRC's rich reserves of taxpayer and third-party data. And 90% of inquiry cases are triggered by information and analysis that's generated by Connect. And those cases for inquiry, they're identified by HMRC's Risk and Intelligence Service, and then they're sent to the relevant departments for possible inquiry. But you're right, I think you've alluded to the fact that just because you've had one of these, it doesn't actually mean there's any wrongdoing. HMRC just want to check what the tax risk is.
So what I've shown on the screen now is the schedule information that you've referenced earlier. So this document was attached to the original letter that's been received by end clients. And Andy, do you want to just go through what really this is asking? We'll try and touch through it briefly, and then we can move on to some questions in about 10 minutes time.
Yeah, okay. So firstly, they're asking for any documents that the business uses to operate the rules. So that could be, you know, the guidance on how they engage workers. So HMRC would like to see all that documentation. Then they want details of any of the systems and the processes that the organisation have got to help them decide whether the off-payroll rules apply. But that's where they engage PSCs directly with. And then they also ask for an explanation. So if there's any difference in the way that they engage PSCs directly as opposed to engaging them through an employment business. Then they want to know about the processes to ensure compliance throughout the organisation. So what they're looking for there is that there's joined up processes and that everybody's singing off the same hymn sheet. Then they want the organisation to identify the number of workers they've engaged via a PSC or other entities, or that's going to be PSCs or partnerships, basically. Then they want to know about the number of workers that the organisation's directly engaged, and so that's a bit, and then split them between inside and outside IR35. And then the next one is the next question is, you know, how many workers engaged via a third party, i.e. an employment business, and again the breakdown between inside and outside of IR35. Then halfway down, they're asking for details of the total spend on contingent labour. Then they want to confirm if you've used CEST, or have you used something else. I mean, just a word on CEST there. Yeah, just because, I mean, although CEST, I mean, we've talked about CEST on numerous times in the past, and we know that its shortcomings. But I think, you know, there might be some people that still believe the myth. I think that if you use CEST and you get an outside IR35 determination, then you're home and dry. simply because HMRC have said, well, we'll stand by the results assessed. But of course, that's only as good as the information that you input into it. And I would say that that statement, we'll stand by the results assessed, means we'll stand by it until we actually launch an inquiry. And otherwise, if that was the case, HMRC wouldn't need to launch these inquiries. They'd just run everything through CES, wouldn't they? So then they asked for the number of workers that they decided were within the rules and then subsequently engaged via umbrellas. And then the number of workers that had previously worked through their own PSC and then entered into employment contracts, which is quite interesting, really. When you think that, what are HMRC checking here? Because bear in mind that they gave an assurance to contractors that they would not look back historically at their status, whether they were working for that same organisation. So that's interesting. I can sort of watch this space really with that one to see if that leads to any of the old style IR35 inquiries into PSCs. And then it goes on to ask for about details of any contracted out service, and why you believed that contracted out service provider was genuine. So it's looking to ascertain whether or not the organisation took reasonable care. And then finally it asks for details of the total spend on contracted out services.
So that's obviously what that letter contains. We hope that gives you insight as to more or less what this compliance activity looks like. Now, Andy, regardless of whether somebody has got one of these letters or is worried about getting it in the future, what do you think is the kind of best first steps to take should you get one? What in your eyes should be the approach taken from an organisation if they get this letter?
Well, I think firstly, we talked about sharing the information with all interested parties, I suppose, in the chain that could ultimately be affected. But if they've got professional advisors, tax advisors, then it sounds common sense, but to notify them as well. And then from that point to talk with your advisor about what the strategy will be in responding to that information request, and then to obviously gather together that information, and then for your jointly to actually review that information before it's actually been sent off to HMRC. Yes, you can have your informal chat, as long as that's only going to be informal and there aren't going to be any tricky or detailed questions that are asked. It's important to remember, I suppose, at that stage, if you do get those kind of questions for HMRC, they can, you're under no obligation to answer those directly. You can say, well, that's information that that will be provided when we respond to your schedule of information. So your informal chat should only be an informal chat. So when you've assembled all that information that's requested in that schedule, and your professional advisor has reviewed it with you, and then you can basically then agree on the wording of your response, because in the clients that we've seen, they've all submitted a letter with the schedule of information, just adding further explanations, And so what you want to avoid is using things like employment terminology, and probably where if you've used employment terminology in any of your documentation, then you probably want to just add some explanations, some supplementary explanations that, well, this is a generic term and it covers this, it covers self-employed situations as much as employed situations, etc. Because terminology with IR35 can be key. You don't want to allow HMRC to jump on anything and start asking you further questions. So the approach is really to take a balanced view as to how much information we provide HMRC. Well, we have to provide what they've asked for, yes. Do we want to provide any more information than that? That will be up to the organisation themselves. I prefer, my own approach is to give HMRC no more, no less than they've actually requested, with possibly some explanations as to where I think HMRC might ask some more questions, and really to try and head those off.
And that's really the skill of the advisor that you use, isn't it, to make that assumption as to what you give a bit more information on than perhaps you need to.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just before we move on to the questions, because there are quite a lot coming through, there's a few common themes in there which we'll definitely get Andy to answer for you. But sort of mitigating the risk of getting this wrong, it starts at your sort of systems and processes, doesn't it? What's a sort of good strategy to mitigate risk in terms of the assessments you do, and then post doing that, what's your options?
Well, it's as you've already said, you should already have had your systems and processes in place for making determinations. I mean, the businesses that we've seen that are currently subjected to these compliance checks all have a thorough system and process that everybody in their organisation understands and follows. Not only from at the point of when a worker's actually taken on, but for ensuring that if there's any change in the contractual terms and the working practices, that the people within the organisation know when to alert the relevant person or persons within the organisation to review their status, and that's what HMRC would be looking for as well. So ultimately, if you haven't got those systems and processes right by the time HMRC come along, then you're going to be firefighting to a certain degree. So they should already be in place.
And post processes as well, there are options available to you, such as insurance, which people like Kingsbridge, there's a handful of other suppliers out there that can give you that type of insurance that will ultimately cover the fee payer risk. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. There's been some questions in the past, Andy, around would having something like insurance make you a bigger target to HMRC? But quite frankly, they one, probably don't know that, and two, it certainly wouldn't make you a bigger target, would it?
No, you're absolutely right, Ryan. I think what you've just said, that HMRC would not know that. And then if we think back, to the days when I was defending contractors with the individual IR35 inquiries, no, HMRC did not know that. And yet we still saw a wealth of contractors being investigated. So I think, personally, bias aside, I suppose, I would say it's prudent to have that kind of insurance in place. Bearing in mind that these inquiries, they could become a bit more detailed, and it could, we could be looking at a certain length of time, certainly not as individual inquiries, but nevertheless, we could be talking, months to a year, possibly, who knows. And then so during that time, it can become quite costly, if you're obviously using your professional advisor to front up the inquiry, whereas if you've got insurance in place, that's your fees covered.
Perfect. Well, I think what we'll do is move on to some of the questions, because there are quite a lot of them coming through, Andy. So if that's okay with you, the first one that I've got here is it's actually more or less related to what we've just spoke about. But do you have any examples of where the R35 insurance, either provided by Kingsbridge or somebody else, has been used to respond to these recent claims? The short answer is yes. Our insurance in particular is responding to claims being made by end clients in respect of these letters that have been sent out. We've got a number of clients who are both insured and non-insured, so that's clients that may have come to us simply because they know that this is the work that we do. Clearly, we can't give you the details of who that is, etc. But yes, the Kingsbridge insurance policy is reacting, and I would imagine that this type of policy out in the market does react to these claims. Indeed, ours is. Andy, I know we've kind of covered this off in brief throughout just talking there, but one question that is coming up a lot is, how are HMRC choosing the businesses that they're approaching? So if we could just give some emphasis on that point that we've already made, there is no sort of overall strategy here, is there? It's more or less a kind of, pull the trigger at a wall and more or less see what it hits.
Yeah, well, I go back to the point made about all HMRC inquiries are risk assessed first. Now, the ones we've seen have been large organisations, and so those large organisations are likely to be the ones that have a good number of contractors that they've engaged. So this is probably more revenue driven. Because of the volume of contractors, sitting in those particular organisations, but they'll have also looked at the RTI reports, employment intermediaries reporting. But I come back to the fact that that they have this huge piece of sophisticated computer software Connect that brings a lot of information together, and it really helps HMRC identify those taxpayers that they probably like to have a more closer look at. But like I say, at the moment, the only conclusion I can draw is it's large organisations with large number of contractors equals potential high revenue national insurance if anything's wrong.
Okay, thank you, Andy. This next question, the letter seems a little misleading as it assumes the hirer is the fee payer. It's the fee payer, i.e. recruitment agency, most likely, that will have to pay any shortfall / penalties. What's your view on this? So I'm guessing, Andy, there it's more of a explanation of the process that an I-35 inquiry now into off-payroll rules would follow, isn't it?
Yeah, so obviously the end client, they are responsible for determining the status of the worker. Therefore, it makes sense that to start with the end client to determine whether or not they've got the employment status correct. Now, we talked earlier about sharing information within the chain, etc. And that's why it's important to notify the fee payer that yes, we've received an inquiry notice and we'll keep you informed as to the progress of that, or we'll keep you informed. We'll inform you ultimately if HMRC decide anything's wrong. Because as the person who posed the question has made the point correctly, it'll be the fee payer that's on the hook for any tax and national insurance should HMRC successfully recategorise a worker or a group of workers. But at this stage, we don't know that. So that's why the employment business isn't involved in the inquiry. They will be if HMRC deem, like I say, workers to be inside IR35, because they'll then be looking for the employment business to cough up the tax and national insurance.
Perfect. This next question is a great question. What is the legal status of a compliance check as per these letters? E.g., is it obligatory to respond to all the questions? As a low-risk, large business, I'm inclined to respond helpfully to such a request, but wondered around the status of such a letter.
It is an inquiry notice. It tells you that in that opening, on that first page, I'm opening a compliance check, and here's the information I require. Now, if you don't provide all the information that they've asked for, all this is going to do is lengthen the inquiry process. And ultimately, if you don't cooperate with them, and I don't see any reason why you wouldn't with the information they've requested, what they can do is issue you with what's called a Schedule 36 information notice. And then there you will be obliged to provide that information within a certain time period. And if you don't, you'll get a penalty. So from that point of view, I don't see the point of resisting any of the information that they've requested for. I think, in my opinion, the information they've requested is quite reasonable. So you want to bear in mind, what you want to be doing is expediting that inquiry as quickly as you can. This is what when we're talking about your strategy, my strategy would be to provide information, all the information HMRC have requested, but probably no more than that, with the caveat that I would add explanations as and where they are required to head off any further questions in a particular area.
Perfect, thank you, Andy. The next one here, can a end client pass this off to a third party recruiting partner and expect them to respond to these information requests? So can the end client pass any of this off to the recruiter and expect them to answer it, basically?
Well, they could do, but ultimately they're responsible. So again, I don't see the point in doing that. They could do it in conjunction with a third party. So, I mean, for instance, I suppose if the recruitment agency were involved in the employment status determination process, then they might want to do it in collaboration with them. But ultimately, it's an inquiry into that organisation. So you can't just outsource it to the third party, because ultimately you're going to be responsible for the answers that you give to HMRC. But like I said, nothing to stop you doing it in collaboration where there is a close relationship and the agency or the employment business is involved in the status determination process. Perfect.
This next one, I think we've sort of touched on it in the session, but it can't hurt covering it again. Is it safe for the end client to have a chat with HMRC, or should they be requesting for the communication to be written, mirroring the approach taken when defending a contractor?
Yeah, so that's the letter says, well, we in the first instance, I'd like a chat, but it does actually say, and as I mentioned earlier, that you don't actually need that schedule of information when you have that chat. So I would say that, I mean, if you don't want that chat, yes, you can actually say, well, let's communicate via email, for instance. But as long as that chat is going to be an informal one, and it might be really to your benefit if the revenue officer is going to set out the course of the inquiry. So the organisations that we've seen, they've all had they've all had their own tax department, so they're used to anyway, having that dialogue with HMRC on a frequent basis, so they wouldn't be too concerned about that. But where you've got organisations that so they don't have their internal tax departments, who might be a bit more reluctant to actually talk to HMRC, we got two options there. You could say, well, I'd prefer to correspond via email if you like, or you could ask your professional advisor to be part of that initial telephone conversation.
There's a question here, Andy, just around penalties. There's a couple of questions around how would penalties be calculated. Can you give some insight into how a end client or a fee payer may actually have a penalty? Like what's the sort of calculation you would use? How is it defined, etc.? What does that look like?
Right. Okay. So bear in mind that for 21-22, there isn't a penalty. So no penalties for the previous tax year, and unless there's deliberate non-compliance. So going forward, there can only be penalties from 6th of April 2022, and penalties are based on a percentage of the tax, of the potential lost revenue, and they're levied based on behaviour. So we start with careless, and that's probably the most likely category where HMRC would be able to apply a penalty. So carelessness is defined as a failure to take reasonable care. So if there was something terribly wrong with your processes that that fell into the category of carelessness, HMRC would be able to potentially apply a penalty in that situation. Now you've got to remember though that if that's your first time, and it would be, I suppose, with the off-payroll rules, where you demonstrated careless behaviour, it is possible to apply for suspension of penalty. Basically, the way that works is that, well, yes, okay, we accept we'd been carelessness on this occasion, but there are conditions that HMRC could set, and as long as we abide by them, within a given period, and HMRC are satisfied with that, the penalty goes. That's waived. But essentially, it's a percentage of the, like I said, the potential lost revenue, and then those penalties increase in percentage where the behaviour is deliberate, and then deliberate and concealed. But if deliberate and concealed is essentially fraud. So, so really, I think realistically, you'd probably only be looking at a careless penalty, which, like I say, for the first offence, could be suspended anyway.
Andy, there's quite a few questions or quite a few points being made around fee payer and engager liability or not liable, etc. So for example, one of these points here is it feels unfair that if a client has determined resource incorrectly, so I'm assuming there they've made the decision that the worker was outside of I-35 but should have been inside, that the fee payer or the agency is going to be responsible for the tax owed. How does the client get penalised considering the costs are borne by the fee payer? So really, Andy, I think what a couple of these questions are getting at is, can you just explain kind of how that liability shifts to the fee payer, and in what circumstance would the fee payer be kind of lifted of that risk and it transfer back to the end client. And I think particularly when there's this type of letter going out, I think that seems to be the common theme around at the point of inquiry, what might happen and why does the recruiter sit with all the risk, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree with that person. You know, it does seem unfair, but unfortunately, that's what the legislation says, and we can't get away from that. But the circumstance in which the pay as you earn national insurance and apprenticeship levy, of course, would sit with the end client would be one, if they hadn't actually passed that status determination through to the fee payer, and also if they hadn't taken reasonable care in making a status determination. You know, that in those circumstances, the liability would not pass to the fee payer, but it would stick with the end client. But those are limited circumstances. So where the end client has taken reasonable care and has followed the letter of the law to the legislation, but nevertheless got the status determination wrong. And I say that when I say wrong, that if they've taken reasonable care, it would probably then suggest to me that we're then getting into the technical arguments around status. Because if you've taken reasonable care and come to a particular determination that they're outside of IR35, and the HMRC then come along and disagree, then we're probably, you know, digging down more into the arguments about status and the or particular areas of status, for instance. You know, it could be over a right of substitution, of course, and you know, where HMRC have deemed it fettered, for instance. So, yeah, more minutiae of status, I would say, in those circumstances.
Perfect. I mean, I'd agree, Andy. You know, the rules are somewhat unfair towards recruitment agencies and fee payers in the chain. I think one thing that, you know, is worth considering is, whilst that risk sits with you, consider something like insurance. You know, again, whether that's with Kingsbridge and you want to, you know, talk about that with someone from our side, whether it's somebody else out there, you know, it's a valid risk mitigation. And you know, as we're seeing already, you know, for the clients that we're responding with or on behalf of, the insurance is playing quite a vital part in obviously forming their overall defence and their process, not just something that you simply rely on to get help from people like Andy. Andy, I think one last question, if I could.
Yep.
The last question, very, very briefly, I'll try and pick a quick one. There's tons in front of me. Can a client pass off the responsibility of determining status to another party in the supply chain, i.e. a recruiter?
Well, they can, but ultimately they're still the ones that are responsible. So whilst you might want to outsource that, so if you were using your recruiter to carry out that function, you're still going to have to sign off the status determination. So ultimately, the book's going to stop with you in that respect. So yes, you can do, but like I say, you can't waive your obligations just because you've outsourced it.
Perfect. That takes us just up to 2 o'clock. Luckily, there's absolutely no Valentine's Day references been made. Everyone's worried, Andy, that we might come across one or two. But as we discussed at the very top of the session, a recording of this will be sent out tomorrow via email. So do look out for that. It might be in your junk folders, etc. But if there's any questions that you have that we've not covered or anyone that we've not got around to answering, we'll try and ensure that we answer as many of those as possible, either in a blog post or if it's something that you actually want to discuss in more detail, then please get in touch with your Kingsbridge contact if you have one. If you don't have one, then just simply reach out to one of the contacts that you've received already in the email, or contact either myself, which my email address is just ryan.dawson@kingsbridge.co.uk, and we'll be happy to point in the right direction internally as to what conversation you might want to have. So for today, thank you for joining both myself and Andy. I hope you found it really insightful, and getting a bit more of a clearer picture as to what compliance activity looks like in the private sector, in the off-payroll working rules. And until next time, it's goodbye from me, and I hope you have a lovely week and a lovely day.